Hello, everybody. My name is Morgan Gianola. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Miami, and I'm going to be discussing my project looking at the neurobiological mediators of differential pain report across language contexts of Spanish-English bilingual adults. So in this talk, I'm first going to go over a little bit of the background literature and our previous study, which set the stage for our current experimental procedure. Then I'm going to talk about the hypothesized mechanisms, which we were trying to assess through our current study. I'll talk about our experimental approach and the results and try and tie those into the broader health and health disparities literature. And then I hope to have time to take questions from everybody. So this project was first born out of the question of how language and culture might influence pain perception. And this idea came from a reading of the linguistic relativity literature, which has shown that a variety of cognitive and perceptual processes vary both across speakers of different languages as well as across language contexts for bilingual or multilingual individuals. Now, interestingly, some of those same factors that have shown to differ across languages are also known to influence pain perception through a number of experimental pain studies, as well as some studies with chronic pain patients. And so we wanted to ask whether language could influence something as objective and clinically relevant as experimentally induced pain. That is, does the language that a bilingual person is speaking when they happen to experience something painful affect the way that pain is processed? Now, to get at that question, we first conducted a behavioral study with 80 Spanish-English bilingual adult participants, where they received painful heat stimulations delivered with this device called a thermode on their forearm, and they rated their pain in a number of different ways. I'm not going to talk about the specific types of stimulations, but I'm just going to highlight that they rated the intensity and the unpleasantness of the pain they received from each stimulation. And importantly, they completed this whole procedure twice on 2 separate days, once where everything was conducted in English and another where everything was conducted in Spanish. The order of those 2 sessions was counterbalanced across participants, where half began in English, half began in Spanish. And importantly, we also included this cultural priming paradigm in the middle of the heat stimulation. So there were stimulations delivered before and after the cultural priming. And this was done to assess whether any language effects on pain might be driven by the language itself versus the cultural frame which that language might be evoking. The idea being, if we saw differences in pain only after the cultural priming, that it would be speaking towards these cultural frame effects as opposed to language-specific effects. So in this study, we found that participants altered their ratings of pain intensity, but not pain unpleasantness across languages, but that it wasn't just that everyone rated it higher in Spanish or in English. Rather, the direction of those language effects depended on participants' cultural orientation. That is, the extent to which they identified more strongly with the US American or the Hispanic side of their cultural identity. So on this graph, the x-axis is this measure of cultural orientation, and the y-axis is their average pain intensity ratings. So this crossover effect is showing that more Hispanic-oriented participants tended to rate the pain as more intense in Spanish, whereas more US American-oriented participants tended to rate the pain as more intense in English. Importantly, this analysis is controlling for things like the stimulation temperature, trial number, counterbalance order, other things that might have affected these pain ratings. And this effect did not differ significantly before and after the cultural priming procedure, sort of highlighting these language-specific effects. So overall, to summarize, we found that bilinguals with a preference for one cultural identity over the other tended to report higher pain intensity in the language associated with their stronger cultural orientation. So this study left us with questions about the cognitive and neural mechanisms of these effects. So this figure is showing some of the areas involved in the pain processing matrix, and I'm going to highlight a couple of different subsystems that we thought might be contributing to the effects we found in the behavioral study. That is, it could be that participants really were feeling more pain in one language versus the other, and it's changes in somatosensory or nociceptive processing that explain that. Alternatively, it might be that participants are just attending to the pain more strongly in their preferred language, or they're sort of more distracted from the pain in their less preferred language. Or there might be effects of online language processing, what I'm calling semantic effects here, where participants are sort of internally describing or talking about the pain, and differences in the lexicon and grammar of English and Spanish are leading to downstream differences in the evaluation of the pain. So to get at which of these mechanisms might best explain language effects on pain, we conducted another study now in the MRI environment, where 39 Spanish-English bilinguals received and rated these painful heat stimulations again. They were now intermixed between the cultural priming images to sort of further ingrain the pain experience within the cultural context in which the language is usually used. This all happened on one day, so there was one scanning session per person, but they were divided between the English segment and the Spanish segment. So they started completely in English and then ended completely in Spanish, or vice versa, based on their counterbalance. We also had participants complete a short semantic judgment task in each language, which was designed to localize regions of language processing within our particular sample. So overall in our analyses, we were interested in comparing pain-evoked activity across the language conditions. And we did that with a couple of different metrics. The first is the NPS, or the neurologic pain signature. This is a multivariate pattern that has been shown to be sensitive and specific to pain processing, but not respond to other aversive stimuli. So higher NPS responses are a metric of greater nociceptive processing. We also conducted ROI, region of interest analyses, to look at average pain-evoked activity in all of the voxels in regions previously associated with somatosensory processing in green, attentional processing in red, or areas involved in online semantic language processing in blue, which was defined from the semantic judgment task. So in this sample, we found again that participants altered their pain intensity, but not unpleasantness ratings across languages. There was a main effective language, so that participants rated pain as more intense in Spanish relative to English, with a trend towards the same interaction we saw previously. The brain mechanisms did show significant language by cultural orientation interactions, where this is showing NPS response on the y-axis. Again, this metric of nociceptive processing was greater for more Hispanic-oriented participants when the pain was delivered in Spanish, whereas it was greater for US American-oriented participants when the pain was in an English context. So again, greater nociceptive processing in participants' culturally preferred language. And this effect also generalized to the somatosensory ROI, so greater somatosensory processing in participants' culturally preferred language. We further conducted a whole brain analysis to see if these results were confirmed. And again, comparing pain-evoked activity across languages, we saw a number of somatosensory processing areas like somatosensory cortex, cerebellum, and the insula, and comparing a cross-level language by cultural orientation interaction, that is looking at areas whose pain-evoked activity increased in participants' culturally preferred language. We again saw a number of somatosensory processing areas, as well as some areas previously shown to be implicated in the attentional modulation of pain. So these results overall highlighted nociceptive and somatosensory changes in pain processing across languages, with some attentional mechanisms potentially contributing to cultural orientation effects. To tie together our neural findings with the explicit pain ratings, we conducted a moderated mediation analysis, where we found that average pain-evoked somatosensory ROI activity was mediating the relationship between language and pain intensity ratings across the full sample, but more strongly so for the Hispanic-oriented participants. Whereas NPS responses, again, this nociceptive pain metric, were mediating this relationship only for the more Hispanic-oriented participants. So tying this finding in with the health disparities literature, it might help to explain why Hispanic patients tend to receive less adequate pain assessment and treatment, as if they're being assessed in a clinical environment where English is the only language, they might be providing ratings which are actually dampened relative to what they're actually experiencing, or at least what their nociceptive pain processing would indicate. So with that, I'd like to thank the study teams that I have been a part of and my funding sources, and thank you all for your attention. I would be happy to take any questions during the live session, or you can email me, mgianola@miami.edu.